It is the That's Enough Eddie podcast. I am your host, Bill Rader, and joining me, as he always does, is my co-host, Sean Kane. How's it going, Sean?
Billy Raids, what's happening, buddy?
We're doing pretty good, We have a very special guest this week as part of our, our shows with guests, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good one, Billy, and it's author Richard Otto from Maine. And, he reached out to us. This is one, that Lisa didn't help us with because she helps us with a lot of them. But, he actually heard our podcast and thought it was really good. And the stuff we're talking about is a lot of stuff that he writes about in his books. And, he reached out to you first. And then you said, you called me up and you said, Sean, talk to this guy, see what's happening with him. And so I gave him a call and we talked about an hour and a half on the phone. And, we were going over everything from, the national security state to the Boston Celtic basketball, because he's a big Celtic fan. So we're talking old school Celtics, Larry Bird. And, he's just a great guy, Bill. He's a tremendous author, very intelligent, well-educated. He wrote 3 books, The Paradox of Our National Security Complex. The second one is Rethinking America, Lies Masquerading as the Truth. And the third, The Hidden War, The Desecration of the Premise of America. And they're just tremendous books, and they cover a lot of the stuff, that we talk about in our podcasts. And, this was a great discussion, Bill, and we covered a lot of ground in this one, buddy.
Oh, fascinating stuff. I mean, we talked about everything from the Operation Paperclip to MK Ultra, a lot of that stuff. Just so many topics we hit with Rick.
Yeah, Chinese Civil War, Korea. We covered everything. It was just awesome. And we're going to have him back because we didn't get everything we wanted to cover.
Yeah. So much material covered. So, I don't know anything else about Rick before we.
Let's get into it, buddy. Without further ado, Richard Otto from Maine.
All right.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to That's Enough Out of You podcast. Today, we welcome in author Rick Otto from Maine. How you doing, Rick?
Hey, guys. How you doing?
Fantastic. It's great to have you on here, and thank you for coming on and doing this. And one of the great things about your books, Rick, is that you talk a lot about the assassinations of the 60s, and you call it like a second Civil War. And that's the way I always felt about it, that it was really an attack on the Kennedy wing of the Democratic Party. And what I want to start today is let's start post World War II, in that period up from World War II up to the time that Kennedy takes office in 1960, and really that 800-pound gorilla that he's up against, which is the rise of the national security state. And I want to start with 2 operations that are going to bring up a name that's really common to our podcast. He's almost like a bad guy in every episode, and that's Alan Dulles. But that'll be Operation Sunrise and Operation Paperclip. Yeah. You want to start there and tell us a little bit about them?
Well, Operation Sunrise, basically Alan Dulles and his cohorts were committing treason because essentially Roosevelt at the Yalta Conference declared that they were seeking unconditional surrender. He essentially on his own was negotiating with Nazi leaders. In return, if he helped them get out and avoid Nuremberg, they would help him fight the communists, who everyone knew that was going to be our next enemy after the war, and go after Russia. And they tried to get people that knew a lot about Russia and could help them understand what Russia was doing and how their intelligence and security forces worked. And so they got people out like Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of the Eastern Intelligence for the German security forces. And they also got Captain Karl Wolff, who was the liaison between Heinrich Himmler and Adolf Hitler. He was an SS officer. And they got all kinds of people out that normally would have faced death probably at Nuremberg. They tried to get Heinrich Himmler out, but he died before he could get to the safety of their lines. These rat lines, as they call them, went through Italy, where none other than James Jesus Angleton was stationed, who was a good friend of Allen Dulles even back then in the OSS days. And
a common name on our show, we bring him up a lot, Angleton.
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, he's a big name in the Kennedy assassination too. John Newman feels that he was the one that set up the patsy, lowered the security for the president, and set up the profile for the patsy.
And he was in control of Oswald's 201 file. So,
yeah, he controlled his files inside the CIA, his counterintelligence special investigative group, and the security division files that were classified top secret. Some of them were confidential, but most of them were top secret. He controlled and manipulated those files as he saw fit.
Rick, what were the years of Operation Sunrise? When did that begin?
I believe it was near the end of the war, when they knew things were that the Germans were going to lose in 1944, 45. It was coinciding with the OSS and military operations that had to deal with Operation Paperclip, because a lot of these they were arresting a lot of people that were going to be brought to Nuremberg, but they were also grabbing scientists that were help developing the weaponry of Nazi Germany at the end of the war, such as von Braun, who developed the Viking rockets. He developed the jet-propelled planes, fighter planes that appeared at the end of the war. And so they didn't want the Soviets to get control over that technology. So they grabbed them first and they brought them into their Special Operations Division, which initially was run by Frank Olson, which is another story. And then later, Sidney Gottlieb was in charge of them.
And of course, Sidney Gottlieb is one of the people, he was running the MK Ultra mind control experiments.
Yes, he was very much involved in their chemical weaponry development, their biological weaponry development, and their mind control operations, which I believe Sirhan was part of.
Yes, we agree with that.
And then explain, what are the rat lines through Italy? What does that mean?
They were lines that they set up, like safe houses they could get people to and then get them out of the country, even bring them to North America. Like they brought Reinhard Gehlen. They even took him, I think, to a Yankees game or something. And or South America, they brought him. A lot of people went to Argentina and other places in South America, and they utilized them as part of their intelligence networks and their war against the KGB and the Soviets after the war ended.
And isn't there's like a region in South America where there's like a German colony, right? Essentially because some of the Nazis escaped and basically set up there, right? Is that?
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know how much they could prove, but a lot of Nazis did go into South America. There's obviously I call it a conspiracy theory because I've never seen enough evidence to prove that Adolf Hitler even got there. And there were some buildings. I don't know if you ever show that show. I don't know if it was on the Discovery Channel, but they were trying to chase the footprints of where the Nazis went into South America. But yeah, there is talk about certain countries where they ended up and they're buildings in the middle of the woods that were under a lot of security. Nobody could get near them. And there was allegedly a German submarine that surfaced off the coast. Those type of things. Nothing's been proven right now. I consider them conspiracies that are interesting, but have not been proven to my satisfaction, at least at this point. In terms of Adolf Hitler being alive, for example.
Yeah, that was supposedly he was in Argentina. I'd never seen any evidence that to back that up.
No, it was an interesting show, but it was like watching something in search of Bigfoot. They never.
Yeah.
A smoking gun that said, "Oh my God, there it is." They didn't have that. So, but anyways, I think that the dynamics have to be looked at and why this happened. There were a number of very important facets that led to all this post-war activities that Allen Dulles and the Rockefellers and everybody was involved in that were on that side of the fence. and wanted to create an empire, and they saw the Soviet Union as a barrier to their achieving that. You had to look at, first of all, the Gilded Age. You had the robber barons in control of the labor, the markets, the politicians, and then Theodore Roosevelt, who they thought was in the vice presidency. They had him trapped. And then McKinley gets assassinated and he becomes president, and they're all upset. And he engages in reforms and breaks up the monopolies, you know, the Sherman Antitrust Act. He's a big supporter of that. He's one of the more progressive presidents we had up until that point. And then you have the Bolshevik Revolution, which was a huge scare to the capitalists in this country, because essentially the people rose up and took out the czars, which basically were running a capitalist country, crony capitalism, but it was capitalism. That, you know, many people don't know, but we had 120,000 troops in World War I in Russia trying to reinstate the czarist government and suppress the revolution with British and Australian troops, and we lost. We ended up pulling out, and the Bolsheviks took over, and Lenin and his people rose to power. And then, of course, Stalin, through murdering a bunch of people, I think including Trotsky, he ended up taking over and became the leader of the Soviet Union, or the Soviet Republic, for 30 years. But in any event, that scared the hell out of a lot of people. And they began to be very concerned about the communists and whether it was going to spread. And even Hitler used that as a scare tactic to get people to support his party and his rise to power. The Nazis and the Jews were the communists and the Jews were the scapegoats for him in his rise to power. And so you have these concerns, and then you also have the Palmer raids under Wilson, where the Justice Department and the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover was there, they went into thousands of homes, arresting socialists, what they considered anarchists and communists. And if they didn't have the right paperwork, they just deported them. There was no due process. There were no search warrants. These were blatant violations of the Constitution, especially if they were US citizens. And that's how scared they were of the communists and infiltration within this country. And then you have the stock market crash. And just to go quickly, you have the rise of Roosevelt. He comes into power. These people are scared to death of Roosevelt. First of all, his cousin was a reformer. Now you have another Roosevelt in power, and he's planning to do things that they consider socialism and communistic, and it's going to take away their power, their financial well-being within the society, and they saw him as an enemy. In fact, there's a great book called by H.W. Brands called A Traitor to His Class, The Privileged Life and Radical Presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He basically was viewed as a traitor to his class. So just quickly, they tried to overthrow him in a coup. People don't really understand that, but they tried to get rid of him. This is a precursor to what they did to Jack Kennedy. This is what they did to the other progressive president. The American Liberty League, which was full of a bunch of financiers and people from Wall Street, including Prescott Bush, basically decided that this guy had got to go. He was going to screw up everything for them, and he was a traitor to his class. So they were figuring they needed somebody to run this 500,000 man army that they were going to get from the American Legion. This was their idea. They needed somebody to give legitimacy to their movement, and they got General Smedley Butler, and they recruited him, and he was the most decorated Marine in history at that point, and probably still is. And he stayed in long enough to figure out what was going on, because he was shocked by the whole thing. He was appalled. So he stayed in long enough to get a skeletal understanding of what was going on, and then he reported that to the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And some of it was leaked to the press, and they had a good time laughing it up. Some of the committee members actually looked into what he testified to, and they found circumstantial evidence that supported him. But the American Liberty League, obviously, when that happened, they backed off. They didn't try a coup again, as far as I know. And then the next important thing is Roosevelt is going into his fourth term. Henry Wallace was his vice president. Henry Wallace was a bigger New Dealer than even Franklin Roosevelt. He was probably in the same political league as Eleanor Roosevelt, as far as being left of center. And the elites didn't want him in power. because they had a strong suspicion Roosevelt was not going to survive his fourth term. They tried to do it in 1940, but Roosevelt told them that if they replaced him, he wasn't going to run. And they knew that would be disastrous for the Democratic Party. So they didn't do it then. But in 44, Roosevelt's health was so bad, he had so much on his plate, he didn't have time or the energy to fight it. They put Harry Truman in, and they got rid of Henry Wallace. Okay, that was very important for them, because Harry Truman did not have the experience. He wasn't as big a New Dealer as Henry Wallace was. He didn't pose as big a threat, and they thought they could manipulate him, and to some degree they did. So those were the dynamics. And now you get to the end of the war, and the Soviets have hundreds of thousands of troops in Eastern Europe. They promised to withdraw back to their borders before the war. They didn't do it. They used as an excuse that they needed a buffer zone to protect them from future attacks from the West. They'd already been attacked twice by Germany in the 20th century. They were having no more of it. So they stayed, hundreds of thousands of troops stayed in Eastern Europe, and they became a Soviet bloc that they controlled, and all the governments were like puppets to Moscow. Okay, so an iron curtain, as Winston Churchill called it in a speech in Missouri, came down over Eastern Europe, and the West became paranoid of what these people were doing. Are they going to be another Hitler? Are they going to go to the Atlantic Ocean? Are they going to go into the Middle East? What is he going to do with these millions of men? And you have to understand, even though the Soviet Union lost 27 million people and a third of their country was devastated, they had the largest military, conventional military at the time. They had millions of men under their control, millions, and hundreds of thousands of them in Europe. There was no way the United States could conventionally defeat them. We'd have to use atomic weapons, which by the end of the war, we were the only ones with those weapons. So these dynamics began to occur, and they became extremely paranoid about Stalin and the Soviet Union and what they were going to do. And that is the context in which Allen Dulles was operating, because what they wanted for the West was to develop this huge empire in which the United States would be the hegemonic power that could dominate the world's resources and the international effects Rome. That's what they wanted.
And Rick, a couple of things there. You mentioned the name Prescott Bush. Of course, that's George's father. And him and Allen Dulles and Dulles's clients there at Sullivan Cromwell, they were actually at one point through Schroeder and the Union banks, they were backing the Nazis. They were funding them.
That is correct. In fact, IG Farben, the company that developed the chemicals that were used in Auschwitz and the other concentration camps, they had strong ties with them, and they represented them. All the way up until the war. In fact, a lot of them were more comfortable with the Germans and the Nazis than they were with our allies, like the ones from Russia.
Exactly.
They never trusted Russia.
Never.
They sided with the Nazis. And you have to understand, the fascists that rose to power all throughout Europe, Italy, Spain, and Germany, they basically were partially in reaction to the rise of communism in the Soviet Republic. And so that's who they supported, because they thought the communists were a bigger threat than the fascists initially.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And of course, let's get into a little bit of that leads us into Operation Paperclip, where they start bringing over these German scientists. And of course, they were key in the NASA operations, and even some of them would win the NASA Distinguished Service Medal, including Von Braun.
Yes, they were part of the Apollo program. They helped us get to the moon in 1969. They were part of our Special Operations Division. In fact, some of the techniques they were using to study human beings, in fact, were not much different than what Dr. Mengele was doing in Auschwitz. It was pretty brutal. Some of these MK Ultra programs, they would kidnap people. And in some cases, they would, in these homosexual clubs in San Francisco, they would get these people and they'd give them LSD or some drug to get them hypnotized, so they didn't understand what was going on. And then they do all these tests on them. And of course, the people would leave and they never mention anything because they didn't want anyone to know that they were there.
Right. That was Operation Midnight Climax.
Yes. That's exactly right. It's all part of MK Ultra.
Right.
MK Ultra, MK means mind control. There was a bunch of subcomponents of it, like Operation Artichoke. MK Ultra was the big one that Helms ordered all the documents destroyed when the Church Committee was being formed. But they still were able to find financial documents in Canada. And that's how they discovered its existence. They found financial documents that they didn't get to and they didn't destroy. They were outside of the United States.
Right.
But so now you have these dynamics, and what you have now is you have Harry Truman in office. He has the atom bomb. He's told by experts that the Soviets probably won't have it for 10 years. And then you have this telegram sent in, and you had the Berlin airlift where Stalin tried to cut off the Allies' rights to go into West Berlin. And you have these insurgencies in Greece and Turkey. They tried to influence the elections, and allegedly they were all communists. And that led to the Truman Doctrine in 1947, in which he said that the United States would come to the aid of any country in which the communists tried to interfere with their elections or take their government. And this all led to the National Security Act of 1947, which is the foundation of the military-industrial complex.
Right. And of course, the creation of the CIA as well.
Yeah, well, that's what it did. It unified the Department of War and the Department of Navy and made it into the military establishment, in which now instead of a Secretary of War, we had a Secretary of Defense. It created the National Security Council, in which the National Security Advisor would now become part of the cabinet. And it also formalized the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And then the most important one was it created the foundation of what became our secret government. It created the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, there was many people that criticized it and weren't sure that we should be doing this because they had fears that this would become an American Gestapo organization that would suppress the liberties of our country, not enhance them. And they turned out to be on the right side of that argument. But initially, the people that were running the CIA were ex-military people, and they agreed with Truman that it should be just an intelligence gathering and analytical agency. All right. Dulles and James Forrestal, who was our first Secretary of Defense, and other hawks inside his administration wanted the Central Intelligence Agency to be much like its precursor, the Office of Strategic Services, and have clandestine and black op capabilities to counter whatever the KGB was doing. And they kept pressuring Truman. And finally, in 1948, he relinquished to their pressure, and he signed NSC 10/2, which defined their other powers that were in their original charter, which nobody defined, and basically gave them clandestine operational power and and they could engage in black ops, in which the rest of the government had to be able to maintain plausible deniability because everybody knew that they'd be doing stuff that was nefarious, illegal, either domestically or internationally. And so nobody wanted to be involved in knowing what they were doing. And in a lot of cases, the senators and congressmen told them, don't tell me what you're doing, I don't want to know.
Right. There's no oversight. And of course, Dulles, creates a killing machine out of this. He's doing regime changes all over the world. And it's just unbelievable.
Well, I mean, what happened was that George F. Kennan, the ambassador of the U.S. to the Soviet Union, basically wrote a letter, a telegram to the White House, basically explaining what he thought was the motivations of the Soviet leaders. And he basically, and I'm paraphrasing, described them as like a wind-up toy, that they just keep moving until they hit something. And he said they had to be contained politically, economically, and militarily. Now, the military component of it, he thought was subservient to the political and economic parts. And so, the Marshall Plan and everything basically was to build up Europe, show that, and make Western Europe a buffer zone of prosperity between us and the communists, to show the rest of the world that capitalism works, communism doesn't work, that kind of thing. Paul Nitz, who was in charge of the National Security Council study group, created NSC 68, which was a report that included the warnings of George F. Kennan, but he turned it into a containment policy in which the military was supreme. They became a military doctrine, much to the chagrin of George F. Kennan. And what was the consequences of that? The consequences of that was we started building bases all around the world. And now we have over 800 bases around the world. We started to develop collective security treaties. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was created in 1949. We started to put missiles, the Jupiter missiles, in Greece and Italy. We started to put in troops in these NATO countries. U.S. troops in Germany, in West Berlin, and those in West Germany. And so that was the consequences of that containment policy. Okay, and later on in 1955, they did one in the Pacific called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which, by the way, I don't know if you know, South Vietnam was included, but wasn't a signatory. But we were obligated to protect them. So that was the beginning of our obligations to protect South Vietnam, was in that document. Well, go ahead,
Rick. Before we get to that, let's backtrack just a little bit, because I want to get to really the Chinese Civil War that they had, because that's important. But before we even get to that, Bill, do you have any question? I think you had a question on Operation Paperclip for Rick, didn't you?
I don't think I had a specific question, Sean. I just, for me, being a person of Jewish faith, it was disturbing at the very least, to hear about this, how we're bringing, these Nazis, I mean, that, yeah, they're scientists. Yes, they're people who have a ton of information and intelligence and probably, I mean, obviously helped the development of our technology, the development of our space program, so many of the things that we have in this country. But, at what cost, at what price? I mean, I think you have to look at it and think, is it worth doing this? Is it worth taking these people who supported Hitler, who supported the Holocaust, whether they were forced to or not? They took part in it. And, whether it's being done in the name of, keeping them away from our enemies or the betterment of our country, or both, it's still something that you feel like you almost have to take a shower after after just hearing about it, because it's so disturbing. But I don't know, Rick, what are your thoughts? I mean, obviously there's different sides to it, I guess, depending on what you feel is the reward, is the progress that we made worth what we did? No,
I think they should have been brought to Nuremberg, and that would have prevented them from becoming part of the Soviet intelligence operations. And they should have faced their fate there, because von Braun, people think, oh, he was just a scientist. No, he used a lot of slave labor to help develop the weapons he was researching. And a lot of people died in that research. And they weren't voluntarily there. The Nazis were using all kinds of people to do the dirty work. And they should have been brought to Nuremberg. Dr. King once said that immoral means cannot bring moral ends.
Right.
And the thing about the Central Intelligence Agency and the people that created it and were the founders of it, like Alan Dulles, Richard Helms, Frank Wisner, and James Jesus Angleton, and he admitted this, they were a bunch of liars. And the only thing they had in common, other than lying, was their desire for absolute power. And he admitted this in a book by Joseph Trento. He interviewed him, and he said that exact words. That's who created the CIA. And their basic principles were this: the end justifies the means. And if they had a decent objective, they didn't care what they did.
Right.
Second, and you see this playing out all over the place. In Syria, for example, why are Americans supporting Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria? the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Right. Yeah.
That's the way they play. And those are, and that's Operation Paperclip went forward. Now, Operation Paperclip was, the military was involved in that. And the Office of Strategic Services, before it was disbanded, was involved in that. Because, you know, people like General Patton, there were all kinds of people inside the government that saw the communists as our next enemy. And we had to prepare for the next war. And we didn't want them to get their hands on these scientists that were developing these heinous weapons. And so we grabbed them first, but we should have grabbed them, arrested them like we did all the rest of them, and sent them to Nuremberg. And that would have deprived the Russians from getting them as well.
Right. I agree with you. And I think, you know, if it meant we had to wait a few more years to go to the moon, so be it. You know, I don't think it was worth what we did. And there's just, so you look at the history of this country, especially the 20th century. I mean, the things that we did in the name of fighting communism, or, you know, or keeping things from the communists. It's amazing. I mean, the McCarthy hearings and all of this, you know, all these things that just hurt innocent people and put people's lives at risk. And then, you know, of course, Vietnam. I mean, you know, and I know I'm getting ahead of where Sean wants to go, but it's just amazing to me, really is.
Well, the one thing is, you know, Rick, you mentioned earlier how Alan Dulles was more comfortable dealing with Nazis than he was with Russian communists.
Yeah, because he had similar views. If you understand how fascism works, it's a combination between the capitalists and business, the military, and then they control the media, and they use the media as an arm of propaganda to manufacture consent for whatever they're doing. And so Alan Dulles, what do you think? He was, all his foreign policy, if you look at his foreign policy, whether it's in Indonesia, Cuba, Latin America, or the Middle East, it's all supporting corporate power. Anything that interfered with that business class and their profits, he was there using the CIA to help them. Much like General Smedley Butler said that he and his forces were used in Latin America and the Caribbean in what they call the Banana Wars. He basically said, when he looked back on his career, he was essentially a gangster for capitalism.
Right. And that happens when you have corporate lawyers like Dulles, you know, and his buddies at Sullivan Cromwell running intelligence agencies.
Yeah, because they didn't care about the U.S. Constitution. They had no interest in serving the governed. None of those ideals that Roosevelt believed in, and Harry Truman, for that matter, believed in, or even Dwight Eisenhower, or especially John Kennedy and Dr. King and Robert Kennedy, they didn't believe in those ideals at all. They wanted to build a Pax Americana enforced on the rest of the world by American weapons of war, so we could exploit the resources of the world and maintain our supremacy and not allow anyone to challenge us, which the Soviet Union was doing, which was a no-no. And so him and his class went about using the CIA as an ability to achieve their objectives, which was to destroy anyone who tried to align themselves with the Soviet Union, or even people that considered themselves neutral. They wanted to be neutral, like Sukarno. You know, they went after anyone that did. It was, you're either with us or against us, to quote George W. Bush. And that's the way they felt. And that's why Roosevelt was such a threat and John Kennedy became such a threat, because they had their own money. They weren't beholden to anybody. They came in and they were going to pursue them with or without their support. As Roosevelt said in one of his speeches to a group of labor, he said, never in the history of man has so much money been spent out of hatred, and I welcome their hatred. Well, Jack Kennedy had the same thing. He went against U.S. Steel. He went against the pharmaceutical industry. He went against the chemical industry. He was trying to reform the whole tax system so that it was engaged in and that it had long-term benefits to the United States.
And of course, that makes them traitors to their wealth class, like you mentioned earlier.
Yes. That's right. And that's why he developed so many enemies. You have to understand, they were willing to wait for 1964, but it became clear to them that the election processes wasn't going to work in their favor. There were two polls done the summer before the 64 election, in the 63, I believe it was, and one was with Barry Goldwater, and Kennedy had 67% of the vote, and Barry Goldwater had 22, and then the rest were unsure. And then Nelson Rockefeller, who was the other potential candidate, it was the same result. I think Roosevelt got a little bit more. He got 27%. So they knew the electoral processes weren't going to work for them. They had to do something more extreme. And that's when, I don't know if you've heard of that story by Professor Peter Dale Scott, but essentially he was a Canadian diplomat,
Right.
so Bay Area, and became an English teacher.
And he was at a party up there.
Yeah, and he went to I think it was the Hoover Institute. Does that sound right?
Yeah, the Hoover Institute. Glenn Campbell was the entrepreneur.
Yes,
I think it was at his house.
Yeah, he was invited there because the fact that he was a former diplomat for Canada, and he thought John Kennedy. I mean, his average approval ratings was 79%. So he thought, people were going to say how good Kennedy was, and maybe they'd say a few negative things, but it wouldn't be that bad. He couldn't believe how much they hated his guts.
Yeah.
That they wanted to get rid of him. And then one person stood up and said, hey, let's calm down. The old man will take care of it. And
of course, we know who the old man is.
David Talbot researched it in his book, Brothers. Yeah, the old man is Alan Dulles. That was his nickname. Coincidence? Yep. I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so.
Just like he took care of problems all over the world, he was going to take care of that troublemaker, John Kennedy.
Yes. And I think, to go with Eisenhower's administration and Nixon and all that, just quickly, Eisenhower basically created the monster that bit him in the ass at the end of his administration. He, believe it or not, he was seeking a comprehensive test ban treaty with the Soviets in 1959. And he asked Alan Dulles, because they were flying these U-2 surveillance planes that went about 60,000 feet above any weaponry that the Soviets had at the time. They couldn't shoot them down, even though they suspected they were flying up there. And they were taking pictures of everything to get an idea of where the military bases were, how much military equipment they had, where their ICBMs were located. And Eisenhower asked him, I don't want anything to interrupt this conference in Paris with Nikita Khrushchev. Should I terminate the flights temporarily? And Alan Dulles said, no, you don't need to worry about it. Those planes are manufactured. The Soviets somehow hit one, they disintegrate before they hit the ground and the pilot would be dead. So, and of course, Alan Dulles didn't want a comprehensive test ban treaty. He didn't want it then, and he didn't want it when Kennedy was trying to do it while he was out of power, running the CIA in his home in Georgetown. But in any event, we all know what happened. Francis Gary Powers was shot down, and the Russians paraded his plane and him in front of the international press, embarrassing Eisenhower. And Nikita Khrushchev said, I want an apology. And Eisenhower said, no, you're not getting one. So he canceled the conference. He canceled Eisenhower's anticipated visit to Moscow. And Eisenhower was furious. He went to Alan Dulles and he told him, you've given me a legacy of ashes to give my successor. And I think it was that incident that finally caused him to put those famous phrases in his farewell address, because the original draft did not have them.
And that's about the military-industrial complex.
And warning about their undue influence and how they could undermine our liberty and our democracy if we didn't keep them under control. And I think he was also doing it, if I may, Sean, he was also doing it because Jack Kennedy had won the election that nobody thought he was going to win. It was like Trump in 2016. Jack Kennedy, an Irish Catholic, was going to beat Nixon, who was part of one of the most popular presidents up until that time. they didn't think they had to worry about him, but he got in.
Absolutely.
And that changed everything. And they engaged in their own ruses, including what they told him about the Bay of Pigs.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
And people should be pissed off about this. Tell people that the president depended on lied to him, who has humiliated him and his administration and the country. And nobody gets mad about it. It's like, well, that's
a
the way
shame.
it goes, He should never have
Dulles
gone
did
along
things.
with it.
Dulles didn't listen to presidents. He did a lot of things behind Eisenhower's back. He did a lot of things behind Kennedy's back.
Yeah.
But Rick, let's get back to the Chinese Civil War, because I think that's really important in this whole thing, and it ties in, to current events today when you're talking about Taiwan.
Well, the paranoid reality.
Let's go back to that.
The paranoid reality, Sean and Bill, that C.W. Wright Mills talked about, these people had about the Russians and their obsession with defeating the Russians, essentially culminated in 1949, because it was in 1950. Three important things happened. The first one is the one you want to talk about. In World War II, the United States was aligned with the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek, and they were sending him all kinds of weapons, which he never used against the Japanese, only in minimal amounts, because he knew there was going to be a war with the communists after the Japanese were defeated. And because Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai were running this huge movement. And in fact, the communists were the ones that really fought the Japanese and helped defeat them on the mainland of China. They were the main forces that fought the Japanese. And so Mao Zedong challenged the nationalists, and they ended up defeating them and chasing them to the island of Taiwan, which is the problems even up to this day. And that's where the nationalist government resides, and that's why there's a Taiwan, and that's why there's this one China policy, and some people don't want to go with it and all that stuff. The one China policy, basically, the United States adopted as our policy after 1972, when Nixon and Kissinger went to China, and then Carter formalized it. So that was the Chinese. That happened in 1949. The communists took China. And it was a major deal. It was such a big deal that even Johnson kept telling his staff that he wasn't going to have another China on his watch in Vietnam. He didn't have another country go commie on him like China did in the Truman administration. Soviets, because they had spies in the Manhattan Project, they brought enough information back that they successfully detonated their own atom bomb in 1949, years ahead of when the experts told Truman they would be able to do it. That shocked everyone in the West. Oh my God, they got the bomb. This changes everything. And then the next thing was the North, who were basically aligned not only just with Mao Zedong, but Stalin had influence in the North. They wanted to unify the whole peninsula. Just like Ho Chi Minh wanted to do that with Vietnam, they wanted to do that with the Korean, and they invaded the South to forcibly unify and get rid of the Western influence. And of course, this is what happened. It's essentially, Truman brought it to a Security Council meeting in the UN, and it's the only time the Russians refused to participate and didn't even show up. Well, they got their UN security thing through and dominated by the Americans, but at least they had something to cover them, a leaf to cover, their private parts. It was the UN sanctioned this, and they went into Korea. And not only did they push them out of the South, they actually did an amphibious operation and invaded the North. And were planning, the Americans with their UN forces were planning, I think, to take over and unify Korea in favor of Western influence. And the Chinese said, no, you're not doing that. And they sent in 1 million combatants, and it turned into the brutal conflict that it was. And that Eisenhower actually negotiated a ceasefire in 1953. And that's where they stand now. There's no treaty. That's why there's the 38th parallel. There's this demilitarized zone. It's a ceasefire that's still going on 60, 70 years later. And that's why you have forces on both sides of the line, and there's still friction and tension there. Those three things occurred in 1949 and 1950, and that basically solidified, I think, the ideological vision of the hawks that the communists were dangerous. They had intentions of taking over the world, and we had to build up a military that was big enough to confront them everywhere they were in the world and prevent their expansion. And not only contain them, the Dulles brothers wanted to roll back communism even where it was situated. In Eastern Europe, you name it. And that's why they were involved in fighting in Indonesia. They tried to overthrow Sukarno in 1958. They were all around the world trying to overthrow these governments that were so-called neutral governments that Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers and Nixon considered
Iran,
communists.
Guatemala.
You're either with us or against us. Is basically what's all of them. Yeah.
Right.
And so and the other thing that Eisenhower did that basically created a problem for himself at the end of his administration is he allowed the NSA and the CIA to run rampant. The NSA was created by Truman in 1952, okay? And these two organizations, most people didn't even know the NSA existed until Edward Snowden or William Binney and Thomas Drake, those whistleblowers.
No such agency.
Yeah, that was 21st century. Hardly anyone mentioned the NSA. Nobody knew who they were. Yet they were collecting everything, even back in those days, against Americans. They were doing all kinds of things. Well, the CIA, which was a separate entity, was also running rampant and out of control, and they weren't being properly supervised, even though Eisenhower tried to supervise them to some extent. But he supported them because in 1953, they got rid of Mossadegh with nobody got killed. It hardly cost them any money. And the reason why they went after him is because he was nationalizing the oil industry. Because he wanted to use the resources to help better the quality of life in Iran. God, that's a novel idea for a government to do.
Yeah, imagine that.
Yeah. And so they got rid of him. And then Jacobo Arbenz did the same thing with United Fruit. They controlled all the most fertile land in Guatemala. And they were extracting all the wealth out, and he wanted to retake it. So he offered to buy back that land at the rate at the value that they said it was worth when they paid their taxes. Of course, they undervalued it when they paid their taxes, and he was willing to buy it at that undervalued amount that they were lying to the government, and they were pissed.
And Rick,
go ahead.
United Fruit was, of course, a huge client of Sullivan Cromwell with John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles when they were there, and also Rockefellers were involved in that company.
It's worse than that. Allen Dulles had stock
in it. Yes, he did.
Do you call that a conflict of interest? I do.
It's a conflict of interest. Yes. It's unbelievable, really.
He should have sold all his stock. He didn't. He had stock. I think he had stock in Freeport Sulfur too. And Freeport Sulfur, people don't know this, but Rockefeller partially controlled that. That was a sub business of one of their larger companies. Yeah.
And of course, they're going to do a lot of mining in Indonesia.
Yeah. I mean,
unbelievable with the gold over there.
We're jumping around, but I mean, in Indonesia, they had the same problem that they had in Guatemala, in Iran, and of course, the Congo. Essentially in the 20s, I believe it was, Greg Polgrain goes into this in his great book,
Battleground Indonesia.
Battleground Indonesia, Allen Dulles versus John Kennedy. And essentially they found these gold mines on one of the islands, West Arion, and it was so secluded, it was extremely difficult to get to through these jungles and mountainous terrain, that they really didn't have the technology to get in there at that point, but they knew it existed. They called the gold mine, I think, El Dorado, and it was the biggest gold mine ever found. And there was other minerals there. I think there was a lot of silver, and they found oil. So Standard Oil were there. They weren't only there with Freeport Sulfur, but they were also there with Standard Oil, and they were trying to figure out a way to get these resources because they were worth billions of dollars. They'd probably be worth trillions in today's money. And Sukarno and Kennedy were never informed of this discovery. And I don't think Truman, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, they never knew it was discovered there either. So it was a secret that the Dulles brothers knew about and their cabal knew about, all their elk. But the presidents didn't know about it.
And just as a side note, Rick, of course, Allen Dulles would send a familiar name over there, George de Mohrenschildt. and he would end up becoming Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend in Dallas.
Yes, he was a White Russian, by the way. So
Who hated the communists.
yes, he
and he
did.
would end up befriending the communist Lee Oswald.
They wanted to retake their country, much like the anti-Castro people in southern Florida wanted to retake Cuba. They had the same type of goals. But the White Russian community, if I'm not mistaken, they had a huge community in the Dallas metropolitan area. But in any event,
Yes.
why is that important? Because when Sukarno rose to power, he wanted to unify all of the 13,000 islands of Indonesia, including West Arion, which the Netherlands, it was a colony of theirs, and they didn't want to give it up. The British didn't want to give it up. And of course, the CIA and MI6 didn't want to give it up because they knew how valuable it was. And they didn't want this commie, Sukarno, who wasn't a communist. He basically was a nationalist. And in fact, the PKI, which is allegedly the largest communist party in the world, Sukarno told Kennedy that they may have communists within their ranks, but they're basically nationalists.
Yeah, but there were a lot of farmers and peasants.
Yes, they wanted the independence of their country from any foreign control. That's
right.
What Sukarno's government was all about. And so when Kennedy came to power, he was butting heads not only with Allen Dulles, who was running the CIA. He never got, as David Talbot said, he never got the memo that he was fired. He's running the CIA out of his Georgetown plush home. And the Rockefellers and Freeport Sulphur and Standard Oil and all those people, they wanted to maintain, in the Netherlands wanted to maintain control of West Arion because they knew how valuable it was. They didn't want it to get into the hands of Sukarno and his government. So they tried to overthrow him in '58 and develop this civil war, and it failed miserably. It was their biggest failure until the Bay of Pigs. And when Kennedy was shown the documents, when he was trying to repair the damage to our relationship with Indonesia, he was given, get this, he was given a redacted document by the CIA.
Unbelievable.
The commander-in-chief was reading a document that's blacked out. But he was able to decipher enough that he turned to one of his aides and said, "No wonder Sukarno hates us. We tried to overthrow his government in 1958."
Yeah. It's just it's amazing, Rick, that we have this entity that sort of operates without any sort of checks and balances. They don't answer to even the president. I mean, we've talked about the CIA before. And it seems to me like that's such a dangerous, and clearly it is, because they've carried out operations, not just around the world, but here in the United States. It's such a dangerous place to be when you have this organization that just sort of has its own agenda and can operate independently of anything, including our government. It's just amazing to me.
Yes. It basically was running its own foreign policy. And President Kennedy, when he came in office, and certainly after the Bay of Pigs, I think he turned to his brother and said, "We're going to have to deal with the CIA." Right. And just to show and buttress what you just said, David Talbot, in his great book Devil's Chessboard, said that they tried to overthrow Charles de Gaulle's government at the time that the Bay of Pigs humiliation was occurring. So Kennedy had all this on his plate. And one of the French ministers called him and said, "Are you trying to overthrow us?" And Kennedy said, "No, I support Charles de Gaulle's government 100%, but I can't speak for the CIA." Can you imagine a president having to concede that?
It's unbelievable. And of course, Dulles was back in the organization, the OAS over there, that was trying to overthrow de Gaulle.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
I'm convinced that Allen Dulles was involved in the assassination. He was either indirectly or directly involved in helping the groups that were trying to assassinate Charles de Gaulle. Because Charles de Gaulle, much like Kennedy, was an independent thinker and was trying to do his own thing. And like in Algeria, he was giving up on that. He was going to let them over time to become a sovereign country. And there were forces inside his country that didn't agree, and they were fighting him. And they were willing to overthrow him or assassinate him in order to achieve their objectives. And the CIA and MI6, which is their twin brother, basically, they do everything together, were probably involved in that.
And of course, one of those OAS guys, guy by the name of Sutre, would end up in Dallas on November 22nd,
Exactly.
1963.
The French assassin, and he was flown out.
Yep.
These are all coincidences, Sean and Bill.
Oh, yeah.
What the hell, you guys are conspiracy theorists?
Right.
There's nothing to that.
There's nothing to see here.
No, no.
Jack Kennedy was just a womanizer. He didn't do anything. We loved him. And so even if he was killed
I know, he was a Cold Warrior
by
and
a
all
conspiracy,
the
it
other
doesn't
stuff.
matter.
Frank
That's
Sinatra.
basically what they've been trying to tell us. No, basically, President Kennedy was a very good man. Did he have faults? Yes, he did. But he was one of the most compassionate men to ever rise to power, especially coming from that class. Him and Franklin Roosevelt were kind of unique individuals.
Well, Rick, we just had Don McGovern on, and I don't know if you're familiar with Don McGovern's great book on Marilyn Monroe, but he went through so much of the research.
Only the review.
What's that?
Only the review written by James D'Eugenio. I haven't gotten the book yet.
Okay, well, he did an amazing job, and he proves where so much of that on Marilyn and the Kennedys was just character assassination and just complete garbage and lies that were made up, to attack John Kennedy's character.
Yeah, William Sullivan basically admitted to that. He basically said that it was all made up, and J. Edgar Hoover was the one fanning the flames.
And Sullivan ran the COINTELPRO operation.
Yes,
for the FBI.
Because they wanted the Kennedys. They couldn't just kill them physically. They had to destroy their character after the fact, because they become iconic heroes. And so they not only were dealing with their physical bodies, but they were dealing with their ideals and ideas after the fact. And so they had to destroy those too. And so if Kennedy was just another warmongering, reactionary politician that cheated on his wife, who the hell cares if he was killed by a conspiracy? It doesn't matter.
But you know what?
Let's just go on and face the future. Stop looking back there. There's nothing to see there. They're just politicians that got it's unfortunate they were killed, but they're not important. When the reality,
I think that backfired, though.
Yeah,
I think it backfired on them, because the Kennedys are as popular today as they ever were. Everybody wants to talk about it, and nobody's going to let it go.
Well, people like you and the both of you, and Monica Wycheck writes about this in her book. I write about it in my books, and I think it's the same for James D'Eugenio and so many people. They had this intuitive sense that there was something wrong with the narrative, because when you watch Kennedy answer the questions at the press conferences, when you listen to friends talk about who he was and what he believed in, you listen to his speeches, like the American University speech or his civil rights address, it doesn't connect with the narrative.
No, it doesn't add up. It doesn't add up to the media's version of Kennedy.
No. And the sad thing is that they use statements that they made against them, and people accept them as fact. For example, the Kennedys had a caustic wit. I'll give two examples of their caustic wit. One was, in Oxford, Mississippi, they tried to get James Meredith admitted to the University of Mississippi, and Governor Barnett promised to have state troopers there and everything. He pulled them all back. And it ended up being a nightmare, because a mob went in, and the U.S. Marshals basically hung on by dear life, and two of them lost their lives, and a number of them were injured. But James Meredith got into the university. And Jack Kennedy had to federalize the National Guard down there, and even though they lived there, they got lost. Can you believe it? They got lost in Mississippi, and they got there 2 hours late. But they got there, and the situation was resolved. But the Kennedys were pissed because they were stabbed in the back by this governor. He was a little weasel, Governor Barnett, and a racist to boot. And when they discovered the missiles in Cuba, which wasn't that far from the Oxford incident, Robert Kennedy walked in the room and said, "Oh, they discovered missiles in Cuba. Do you think they can hit Oxford, Mississippi?" I mean, that's caustic wit. And some people were looking at him like, "What are you talking about? This is serious, But in a way, James Garrison had that type of caustic wit. Another thing was, and this is used in Seymour Hersh's Hatchet Job, The Dark Side of Camelot, which he was paid $100,000 up front. And he's done some good work. It's amazing how Noam Chomsky and people like Seymour Hersh can promote this Yes.
Oh, Chomsky.
And
Yeah,
assassinate
he's
the
something
Kennedys
else.
and pretend they had no ideals and they weren't part of they weren't important, integral parts of the revolution that
Because those guys have an
the
agenda.
1960s. But basically, in that book, and Matt Taibbi, a journalist, repeats this quote as though this is the way Kennedy was. Kennedy basically was in the Oval Office and he said, "So who we're going to kill today?" It was caustic wit. He wasn't for murdering people. He was against assassinations.
Right.
He was making a joke, a caustic joke, a dark joke, but
Right.
nonetheless, it was a joke. It wasn't his policy. These people conflate these jokes with policy, and it's unfortunate when they do that. And, you wanted to talk about the Civil War in the 1960s. Essentially, it wasn't a civil war like we fought in the 1860s, where there were battlefields and armies. It was an ideological vision of the country that we were fighting, and it was a covert operation. Basically, the Kennedys and Malcolm X and Dr. King and Fred Hampton and a number of people and Sean Gallagher and Allard Lowenstein and George McGovern and Hubert Humphrey. They were all on one side, and then there were the Dulles brothers, the Rockefellers, the Nixons. They were all on the other side, and they fought this in a covert way, controlling the media under Operation Mockingbird, Operation Chaos. They were infiltrating groups. COINTELPRO was infiltrating and assassinating leaders of their groups, like Fred Hampton, who led the 21-year-old in Chicago, who was part of the
Black
Panther
Panthers.
Party, who was a rising star, and they got rid of him.
Dynamic personality.
Yeah. And Malcolm X, we don't have to discuss whether he was a conspiracy. There was 3 gunmen.
Yeah, how could that be a lone gunman?
That's a conspiracy. Case closed. It comes as how much was the New York Police Department and the federal agencies involved in that case as a proxy for their death, much like we use the mafia as a proxy in the assassination attempts on Cuban leaders. And then Malcolm X, Dr. King, that clearly, the King family won a wrongful death lawsuit. James Douglas wrote a great article on it. And they won
because he was there.
Wrongful death, believe it or not, you have beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the criminal standard, that's the highest. And then the next level is clear and convincing evidence. And you use that for wrongful death lawsuits and termination of parental rights, those type of things. And it may not be 98% or 99%, but it's like 75 to 80%. And that's what the 70 witnesses that testified proved by that standard, that there was a conspiracy and federal agencies were involved in the death of Dr. King. And so
today they honor with a holiday.
Now, the people that were killed weren't just domestic. Dag Hammarskjöld was killed, the UN Secretary General,
right,
in a mission to Congo. They had,
and he was also tied with Indonesia too, Rick. The Hammarskjöld.
Yeah, and Harry Truman knew it, probably because he talked to John Kennedy, who probably knew that it was an assassination. Because Harry Truman told the New York Times he was on a mission, he was going to accomplish something, and they killed him. Notice I said they, and he was hoping the press would follow up because he wouldn't say anything more, and the press never did. They're not. They're supposed to be curious. I don't know. They weren't curious. They never.
They don't want to open that door, Rick.
Yeah. They didn't want to open the door with the Kennedy assassination either. And I think a lot of them felt that it was an event that if they did open the door, it could unravel the whole government, and there could be an uprising in this country. And in fact, J. Edgar Hoover said that to Billy Byers Jr., a friend of his son, when he was visiting them in California. The teenage son asked him, "Hey, did you really think that Lee Harvey Oswald did it?" And he sat there on his lounge chair for a little while, and then he said, if I told you what I really know, it could be very dangerous for this country. Our government could completely unravel. And as I said in my book, how could a lone nut be that dangerous?
Right.
Exactly.
A lone nut who died 2 days later. Right.
By a guy who wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy from testifying.
Right. Well, it's like Vincent Salandria, the dissident attorney.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Him and his brother said, if Lee Harvey Oswald survives the weekend, maybe he did it. If he doesn't survive the weekend, it was a conspiracy.
Yeah.
So we all know what happened. So.
Well, yeah, we sure do. We all watched it. Well, I mean, I didn't watch it.
Well, we weren't born yet, Billy, but
we've
we
seen
know what happened. But it's just amazing. But Rick, this was really good. We don't want to take up too much of your time. We didn't get to everything that we want to talk to. So maybe if you're nice enough to come back, we could talk about, how this all ties into being relevant today. But we could do that on another show. But is there anything that you want to discuss that we didn't talk about yet? Like, do you want to go into NATO? A little bit more about the creation of NATO?
Well, I mean, NATO is a complex subject. I mean, they were created in order to help contain the Soviet Union and form a military security alliance to achieve that goal, because the United States couldn't do it alone, because obviously we had 3,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean to cross to get troops over there. And it's very, very difficult and logistically to get enough men over there to confront an army that's right there. It's like, it's like playing a football game away from home. You always want to play at home. And so they had a clear advantage in numbers and troops and equipment. And the only way to turn the tide would be atomic weapons. And thankfully, we didn't try to do that. Although the Strategic Air Command did have a secret plan to engage in a preemptive war with the Soviet Union and China. And they had hundreds of cities they were going to blow up. And they presented it to President Kennedy. And this is in James Douglas's book, JFK and the Unspeakable. And at the first meeting, when they told them, hey, that 400 million people would die, maybe 15 to 30 million Americans, but that was acceptable collateral damage, John Kennedy stood up and walked out the door, and he turned to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, and said, and we call ourselves the human race.
Unbelievable.
And they tried to do it again in 63. They said the door was closing. We could, as General Curtis LeMay said in one of his quotes, that the world's going to look back at the time when we could have defeated the Soviet Union without skinning our elbows. We could have just annihilated them. These people, they were sick. And Dr. Strangelove wasn't much of an exaggeration of the way they were.
No, and LeMay was one of the worst.
Yeah.
LeMay had such a toxic relationship with Kennedy.
Him and Admiral Burke, Admiral Burke, General Lemonster, and General Thomas Power were lunatics, and they were in positions of great power in the United States. And I believe, that General Curtis LeMay is one of the people that had foreknowledge that Kennedy was going to be killed, and that's why there was all these shenanigans of where he was that day.
Sure, and he ends up at the autopsy.
Yeah, smoking a cigar.
When he was supposed to be in Canada.
Yeah.
Or no, he was supposed to be in Michigan hunting, but he was actually in Canada.
The only thing I'd want to just mention, and of course we'll talk about it, whenever you guys have time, just let me know, is how important what's happening to Julian Assange is for freedom of the press, and this censorship that Matt Taibbi and other journalists are showing in the Twitter file downloads. The First Amendment is the foundation of everything that we are as Americans and what liberty we have left, because I believe we're a corporate oligarchy right now. But essentially the liberty and the republic that the founders gave us, and that's why it's the First Amendment, freedom of the press and freedom of speech, is the foundation of everything else. And George Washington said, if you take away our freedom of speech, we will be led like sheep to the slaughter. They knew how important freedom of speech was, freedom of thought. And that's why this censorship is extremely dangerous. And the other thing is Robert Kennedy Jr. in an interview recently, I think it was with Laurie Spencer. I don't know if you know her. She's a big JFK assassination researcher and admirer of President Kennedy. He basically told her, when in history has the censors been the good guys? When have they been on the right side of history?
Yeah.
They never are. They never, because they have ulterior motives.
Right. Of course.
Nefarious motives. And you may not care about some of the people that had their Twitter accounts suspended, but some of them were doctors who were trying to get out a message to say, hey, we could do it this way. We could address COVID this way. Why wouldn't we be afraid of that and not have a discussion? And so there were a lot of people that were being censored. And Russiagate, I don't know how you guys feel about it, and I hope I don't offend anybody, but Russiagate was a hoax. And it was against a president that I don't admire that much. But nevertheless, as Ray McGovern said, it was a bloodless coup by our intelligence community, the Democratic establishment, Hillary Clinton and her people, because it was a lie. And it helped establish this second Cold War we're dealing with, basically, because the Russians have been so demonized, people don't even, it's just like the McCarthy era. We're going through another McCarthy type era, where whenever there's something that goes wrong in this country, it's because of Putin or the Russians. That's the same way it was back then. And that's the same thing that Kennedy was fighting against in Vietnam, in Cuba, in Congo, in Indonesia, was this sense that the communists were so evil we could never talk with them. And as he said in his American University speech, we had to re-examine our own attitudes about peace as much as they did, that we had some work to do as well. And I think that's what I want to leave people with. I think censorship is extremely dangerous. I don't care who you're censoring. It could be Nazis. As long as they're not violating those rules that were set out by the Supreme Court, like you can't scream fire in a crowded theater, you can't promote hate speech such that it's going to kill somebody, it may lead to someone's death. They already have those rules. They already have them on the books. We don't need secret people inside of social media platforms or NGOs that are funded by the government telling people what to do and who to censor, because that's a dangerous and slippery slope, and we'll be led to the slaughter like sheep. That's my last comment.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you, Rick, and thank you so much. Hey, Rick, you want to plug your book before we wrap up here?
Yeah, I wrote a trilogy. The first book was The Paradox of Our National Security Complex. It was basically I started researching it, not to write a book, but to send emails to my friends because I was so aghast what I was discovering. And basically what I discovered briefly was that the paradox was that our national security complex wasn't enhancing our liberty, wasn't promoting democracy around the world, and it wasn't enhancing our security. It was undermining all three of them. And the JFK assassination was one of the seminal moments that proves it. We've never been the same since his death. And the second book was the process I went through, because when I was a kid, just quickly, I don't want to hold you guys up, but when I was a kid, the affection we had for this country was genuine, and we just loved this country so much. We were so proud we were Americans. And the cover of that book, I don't know if you've seen it, with my friend and I holding a football, this is American football, America, we're the best, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I had to rethink that country, because all the ideals that I thought we represented, we don't represent. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the world doesn't see us the same way. As George Galloway, the former member of parliament, said, that when he was a young man, everybody wanted to be an American. Everybody admired America. People around the world loved Jack Kennedy. But after his assassination, it's never been the same. And today, a lot of people are tired of being bullied by the United States, whether by sanctions or military operations or covert operations that overthrow their governments. They're sick and tired of it. And nobody admires us anymore. They fear us, but they don't admire us. But when I was a child, they admired us. We were a leader.
Yeah.
We built the best cars in the world.
Right.
And you can't say it, So that was my second book. I had to rethink my country. And then the third book is The Hidden War. It's basically the Civil War of the 1960s and the consequences it has for us today, and the desecration of the promise of America. What happened to that vision of America that John Kennedy, Dr. King, and Bobby Kennedy talked about? Because it doesn't exist. We as a people have never reached the promised land. And the middle class that we were so proud of is contracting.
Yeah, absolutely is.
So that middle class is going away, and quite rapidly. 80% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's sad. And I'll give you another thing. We're squandering our resources on war. It's making a lot of people rich, the merchants of death, the defense contractors and people in the Pentagon and stuff, and people that have stocks, like the Congress people that do their insider trading. But it's basically forcing all the rest of us to live in austerity. And here's one figure that should shock you. And when I tell it, nobody seems shocked. Chris Hedges, in his book, I can't remember the name of his second to last book, he basically said that America spends $32 million an hour on war and maintaining our military industrial complex.
Wow.
We put it into infrastructure, helping the poor, rebuilding our schools, our medical institutions, providing universal health care, rebuilding the trains so we don't have an East Palestine situation, where they're not 1,000.
You can kind of take that back to Eisenhower's speech right there, the threat that he warned us against.
Yeah. I guess it's more profitable, Rick, to kill people than it is to help people and have them live comfortably.
Well, that's what Thomas Malthus believed, and that's who a lot of these guys like Rockefeller looked up to and idolized.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I asked Leno Sinek when I was doing the Black Op Radio, my second one I did with him. I don't know if you listen to Black Op Radio.
I do. I listen every week.
Site. It's a lot like yours. You guys do cutting edge work, and Len has been doing it for 30 years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But what I was saying was, can you imagine any president, even Barack Obama? He won a Nobel Peace Prize, but I don't think he deserved it. He's not the same as the Nobel Peace Prizes that I think people deserve, like Dr. King. I mean, Dr. King, against all kinds of violence, he maintained his peaceful demonstrations. The guy had courage like you've never seen before, going against people that hated his guts.
Right. And we talked about how those assassinations really marginalized our leaders in the civil rights movement and presidents, the office of the presidency, where they know there's a line that they can't cross. And if they cross that line, same thing that happened to the Kennedys and MLK is going to happen to them.
You and I, when we were talking informally a couple of weeks ago, you brought it out in one of your interviews that Barack Obama was sitting at a fundraiser dinner, and one of his friends said to him, "How come you're doing these policies? What would Dr. King think?" And he stood up and he walked away and said, "You know what happened to Dr. King?
Yeah.
Why did you become president of the United States if you were going to become a stooge for these people?" But anyways, think of any president today that would give the American University speech. That America will never start a war. We don't want a war. We've had enough of war. And that's why the topic of this speech is going to be about peace.
They wouldn't last very long.
And not just peace in our time, but peace in all time. Name a speech given by a president in the last 40 years that even comes close to that. It's one of the greatest speeches of all time.
Probably the best. Yeah. Nothing even close.
Yep.
Kennedy was different. He had a vision. He was a true leader, and we need that leadership today. And there's just no leadership.
Yeah, that's why at the end of my book, The Hidden War, if I could just end with this, the conclusion I call "Where Are the Leaders?" And at the end of that section, I basically, after discussing, the assassinations and how we ended up where we ended up, I quoted Simon and Garfunkel's, from The Graduate, Mrs. Robinson.
Right.
You guys look so young.
Sure.
I don't know if you know.
We know about
No.
You young guys.
We're not that
young, but we still know.
But I said at the end, I said, the nation struggles while marching in the streets, leaderless. There are no champions to unify the cause and inspire righteous change. It is as sung by Simon and Garfunkel in their theme song written for the movie The Graduate, entitled Mrs. Robinson, that won them an Academy Award for Best Song in 1970. A nation that even then was in search of heroes. They said, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you. What's that you say, Mrs. Robinson? Jolton Joe has left and gone away.
It's pretty powerful.
Powerful stuff.
Yep. Well, Rick, we couldn't thank you enough. We appreciate, we know we've taken up a lot of your time today, but we really appreciate you coming on, and we will definitely have you back. This has been fantastic. This is what our podcast is all about. It really is. So
yeah, getting to the truth. That's what we try to do, Rick. And thanks for coming on. And the next one, you know, I really want to go into a lot on Julian Assange, because I think that's really important, you know, in the censorship.
Yeah, we can.
So we'll have you back if you want to come back.
I love to come back. You guys aren't taking up my time. If my wife was here, she'd say, "Oh, my husband could talk all afternoon about this stuff." In fact, I can't even shut him up.
Well, this is
all right, Rick. Thank you, Rick.
Hey, you take care now.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Great.
Oh, that was good, Billy. A lot covered in that one, pal. I mean, there was just so much ground that we covered in that. I mean, you know, of course, Alan Dulles' name always comes up, but you know, the important stuff we talked about, like Operation Paperclip and Operation Sunrise. It was just a tremendous conversation, and a lot that ties into what's going on today in current events with Taiwan and Russia. And it's just you know, a real important conversation about, you know, the media. It was just well-rounded, buddy.
Yeah, no question. I mean, clearly he's not a fan of mainstream media, and you know, just you kind of get the idea where he's coming from, some of the things he said. But yeah, he was a great guest. We can't wait to get him back on, and I mean, we have so much more to talk to him about.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think we'd cover everything we wanted to, but we got a lot covered. We got more than I thought we would. But yeah, we definitely have to have him back, because we left open a lot of stuff. Yeah.
All right, man. Well, this was a great one, great get for us, and again, hopefully we'll have him back. Richard Otto, great author. All right, Sean, we're gonna wrap this up. All
right, buddy.
Great questions, and
that's enough out of you.